Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take sources you've shared and really pull out the key knowledge fast. Think of it as your way to get properly informed, without feeling buried in information.
Exactly. And you, our listener, you're curious, right? You want to get the full picture, get those aha moments, but skip the overwhelm.
That's the idea. And today, we're jumping into something pretty complex. Bitcoin. We're looking at its geopolitical side, the challenges folks face pushing for it in D.C., the politics around it.
And even how it ties into bigger things like free speech and, well, technology itself.
Yeah. The source we're diving into is a YouTube video, The Separation of Money and State, David Zell, ex-Peter McCormack. Our mission here, to really get the main policy arguments for Bitcoin, understand the political headwinds, and see how it connects to those broader values you care about.
Okay.
Let's do it. So maybe starting with this idea that Bitcoin isn't just, digital cash, the source talks about it being like an insurance policy.
An insurance policy. How so? Well, for individuals, obviously, protecting assets, but also, and this is interesting potentially for nation states too, there's an argument that the U.S. adopting, or let's say fostering Bitcoin could be a strategic plus.
Right, especially against rivals like China. I think the source mentioned the digital yuan.
Exactly. If people globally have an option like Bitcoin instead of a state-controlled digital currency, well, that's seen as pushing towards the kind of economic freedom the U.S. generally supports.
Okay, that makes sense. And this ties into the Bitcoin Policy Institute, BPI, right? You mentioned?
Yeah, BPI. Their whole goal, as described, is making the case for a world with Bitcoin, focusing specifically on the public policy side of things.
And they're careful, it seems, not to just be pumping the price or telling people to buy.
No, the emphasis in the source is definitely on the broader benefits. What good does it do the world if Bitcoin exists and people can, choose to use it? It's about potential societal impact.
Which brings up a challenge, doesn't it? How do you convince people of Bitcoin's value if it's not just about the price potentially going up, moving past that whole speculative narrative?
That's the crux of it. The conversation seems to be trying to frame it more fundamentally like freedom, individual economic choice.
So even if I think holding Bitcoin is a bad idea, you should still have the right to do it, like having different options for storing value.
That seems to be the core argument presented, a diverse marketplace for wealth preservation. Now, things get, political.
Ah, yes, the politics. The source mentions a view that upcoming elections are like make or break for Bitcoin.
It touches on that, yeah. But it also offers the counterpoint. Bitcoin's decentralized nature means it might just keep going, regardless of who's in charge.
There was that interesting bit about a potential Trump presidency. Maybe better short-term for Bitcoin, but risks.
Right. The potential upside mentioned is perhaps friendlier policy. But the risk, the source suggests, is it becomes much more politicized, a partisan issue.
Which, ironically, can make progress harder, right? The more attention something gets.
Exactly. That's a point raised. Increased visibility isn't always helpful for policy. If it gets caught in that left-right battle,
Then one side might oppose it just because the other side seems to like it.
that's the fair express, yeah. That kind of division could really block sensible regulation or broader acceptance.
And what about the other side? Potential risks under a Harris administration were mentioned too. Something about choke points.
Yes, referencing Nick Carter's work, I believe, the idea of choke points is basically using regulation not to ban Bitcoin outright, but to squeeze the places where people buy, sell, or use it easily, the exchanges, the fiat gateways.
Making it harder to access.
Kind of, yeah. Though, as the source rightly points out, campaign talk is one thing. Predicting actual policy before an election, very tricky.
So political winds shift, but the underlying tech and the demand for decentralized options might just stick around.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk specific policy worries. Tail risks.
The source brings up potential negative actions. People like Elizabeth Warren are mentioned, and concerns about who gets appointed to key financial regulatory roles. The language used is pretty strong, but the basic worry is about restrictive rules.
And that proposed excise tax on mining. That seemed concrete.
Yeah, that's a specific example. The argument is it could just push miners out of the U.S., which might not be the intended or maybe desired outcome. Its discussion shows there's definite opposition.
What about the really big risk? The source mentioned something about a major financial crisis.
Right. That's framed as perhaps the biggest, though maybe less probable, risk. If there's a huge crisis, and Bitcoin is somehow seen as making it worse, could a government try to ban it? It's floated as a possibility.
And if the U.S. did try to ban it, what then? the source seemed unsure.
Very uncertain. The idea of civil disobedience even came up. People just keep using it anyway. It highlights how hard it would be to actually enforce a ban on something so, global and decentralized. Makes you think.
It really does.
Yeah.
Which leads nicely into this argument about why Bitcoin might actually be good for the U.S., maybe even for the government. Seems counterintuitive.
Well, the analogy used in the source is the printing press and the church. Established powers facing disruptive tech can either fight it, try to keep control, or adapt, find ways it actually helps their goals.
So the argument is Bitcoin helps America achieve its goals. How?
By promoting values like economic freedom, providing an alternative to systems like China's digital yuan, especially in, say, the global south. It aligns with broader American ideals, the source suggests.
Like the internet, maybe. Initial fears, but ultimately seen as beneficial within a framework of freedom.
That's a parallel drawn, yes. The idea that open societies ultimately benefit most from technologies that boost political and economic freedom.
I think Radio Free Europe was mentioned, too, as a Cold War example.
Yeah, projecting Western values. Bitcoin, in this view, lets people in authoritarian places kind of vote with their money, gives them some economic autonomy they wouldn't otherwise have.
Fascinating. And this connects to freedom of speech somehow.
It does. The discussion contrasts the U.S. culture of freedom with the U.K.'s approach, where there are things like hate speech laws, different attitudes.
That anecdote about Peter McCormack and the AR-15 photo illustrated that, didn't it? Different cultural takes on expression.
Definitely. And there's a worry expressed in the source about free speech absolutism maybe declining. Concepts like misinformation being used to justify limits.
So how does Bitcoin fit in?
Well, the argument put forward is that Bitcoin itself, the code, the act of running a node, transacting, could potentially be seen as a form of speech or even freedom of assembly.
Really? Like assembling on the network?
That's the idea explored, citing people like Ross Ulbricht, Susan Joseph, suggesting there might be legal arguments for protecting Bitcoin under those principles: protected expression, protected association.
Including angle. Okay, so with all these arguments, what about actually making the case? Advocacy and the challenges.
Well, the source notes the existence of a very passionate base of Bitcoin supporters. Ideologically driven, financially invested, a rabid army is the term used, I think.
That certainly helps get attention.
It does. And the importance of privacy tools for Bitcoin is highlighted too, especially for activists in risky places. Organizations like the Human Rights Foundation, HRF, get a strong mention.
Yeah, the source seemed genuinely impressed by HRF's work.
Very much so. Advocating for Bitcoin specifically as a tool for human rights, for freedom, it reframes the whole debate away from just investment.
And the source wasn't shy about calling out opponents, right? Figures seen as close to traditional finance.
No, there's criticism there, suggesting some opposition comes from those who see Bitcoin as a threat to the existing financial system.
There was even a wish expressed, like getting opposing views in a room together. Senator Cruz and Rana Forohar were mentioned.
Yeah, highlighting the need for more open debate, trying to bridge those gaps.
But advocating in D.C. sounds tough. The source mentioned crypto's bad reputation overall.
It's definitely a challenge, the whole crypto industry image problem. Interestingly, the collapse of FTX was described as a kind of turning point for BPI.
How so?
It apparently allowed them to stand out more clearly, to say, look, we're focused just on Bitcoin, its principles, not all that other stuff. It built credibility, supposedly.
And they went ahead with a conference right after FTX. That sounds risky.
The source called it a YOLO decision, yeah. Bold move, but it paid off, apparently. Showed they were serious about Bitcoin itself, even when sentiment was terrible.
What about that article, Why the Yuppie Elite Dismissed Bitcoin? What was the point there?
It was used to explain why some people in power just don't take Bitcoin seriously, see it as, well, dumb or silly. Overcoming that perception is a huge hurdle for advocates.
It's a funny thing, though. The source also suggested that when people start expressing concerns about Bitcoin's negative impacts,
it paradoxically shows they're starting to take it seriously. If it wasn't seen as potentially significant, why worry about its consequences?
True. And finally, the impact of politicization again, and those online cyber hornets.
Yeah, the source touches on how that very aggressive online behavior can actually backfire. It can turn off policymakers who might otherwise be open to listening. Makes nuanced advocacy harder in this, very polarized environment.
Okay, so wrapping this deep dive up, We've really covered a lot. Bitcoin's potential as this geopolitical tool, an instrument of freedom, maybe?
Yeah, but also the very real political fights, the regulatory hurdles, the negative perceptions it still faces from the wider crypto world sometimes.
And those deeper connections to values like free speech. Hopefully, listening to this gives you a much fuller picture than you'd get just from headlines.
We certainly hope so. It's about understanding that complex dance between technology, politics, and uh, individual liberty.
So we'll leave you with this to think about. There's this inherent tension, isn't there, between government wanting control and these decentralized technologies like Bitcoin emerging.
hmm How do we as societies strike that balance between security and freedom in this digital age that's changing so fast? And maybe, just maybe, what part does your own understanding, your own actions play in shaping where we end up?